So this is our second webinar, so continue to bear with us. If you missed the first, you can view it at our YouTube channel. I've shared the link in the chat, so just check that out if you missed the first. In the first installment, Dan explored our natural and cultural history associated with coasts and a big picture overview of these remarkable ecosystems. Some points of business. At the end of the presentation, we will have some time for questions, so please type them in the Q&A tab. Feel free to use the chat to add comments, ideas, and to let us know why you're interested in this topic. Going much further, I just want to acknowledge that the land on which we work is unceded Mi'kmaq territory, and today I would like us to take a moment to consider our island without the forces of commodification, without colonialization, without the demands of trade and export, and just take a minute to think about our life in partnership with nature and what that would actually look like, and how that must have felt for the Mi'kmaq for millennia, and what a loss that they must still feel today. So it's going to take a minute just to think about that as we think about our coasts. So I'd also like to acknowledge now our funders. These webinars are part of our community-based approach to restoring PEI's Coastal Shield project, made possible with the financial support of PEI's Climate Challenge Fund. The goal of this project is to provide islanders like yourself with the knowledge and skills needed to take an active role in restoring our coastal ecosystems that will in turn protect you and your homes, infrastructure, and businesses. No form of armoring is permanent, and working with nature is a long-term solution and investment. Again, tonight's presentation will be led by Daniel McCrae. Daniel has been continues to be a key member of our McPhail's team. For the last 6 years, he's been studying Krumholtz coastal habitats and is now turning his work into the basis of his research as he pursues his master's in environmental science at UPEI. So, once again, without further ado, I give you Daniel McCrae and Coastal Communities and Natural Neighbors. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much, Eric. All right, screen sharing, I can do it. All right. Yeah, thanks so much. I think a lot of you were here last week. I don't actually know that though. Um, so again, just to if you are new to it, then thanks for stepping on in the second one. Um, Yeah, so today's presentation, as Eric said, is coastal communities and natural neighbors. We're going to be, we kind of started really broad last time, if maybe just some of your chagrin, and we zoned out to, thousands and hundreds of years ago, and we moved our way to the present day. We went from the big picture of the island and looked at some of the coastal processes and moved our way back down. And so we're going to continue that kind of honing in onto each property, and we're going to head into different habitats today. I didn't have my email on there. You can always find it on the McPhail Woods website, but if ever you have questions or anything like that and you want to just email them off, then you can also do that. Or if you have a plant you want to send me pictures of, I like IDing plants, you could do that.
Just a quick question. Sorry,
Yes.
guys. The chat is currently not available to the participants. Just you can just type them in the question and answers though, and we'll see your thoughts there.
So you're monitoring that one, Eric, because I
Yeah.
can only see all this nature glory on my screen.
Yeah.
Um, Perfect. Yes. So I'm sure if you're on this thing, you would have had to go to our website to register. So you know who we are. But yes, we're a nonprofit. We've been operating since 1991. We do a whole bunch of different stuff. You can look on our website. And especially, we'll talk more about this in later sessions. But we sell native trees and shrubs and wildflowers and ferns and grow them. So for coastal restoration, that's pretty important. But yeah, I won't spend too long on that. And of course, if you've come to the webinar, this is one of four parts of our coastal challenge fund project restoring our coastal shield. So these webinars are starting things off, but we're getting going very soon in the next couple of weeks with our first volunteer plantings with some of us there too, with the PEI provincial parks. We're also doing coastal plant propagation, and as we mentioned before, we're working to put all of this into a wonderful free booklet that will be launching later in the year once we finish it. And of course, as Eric said, I got the real lucky opportunity to look at all these coastal habitats over the last 6 years. Um, work with a whole bunch of wonderful groups, and these are all groups that have information and help for you too. We'll talk more about them as they come up in specific scenarios. But again, thanks to lots of great funding and lots of great support on learning this stuff and kind of inspiring the work that we're doing now. I already kind of said what we did last time, but yeah, last time on Coastal Webinar Series, we talked about, yeah, the historical resilience of our coastal habitats and the rest of the habitats on PEI. You know, we went through natural history, kind of our love for it across the board as humans and as islanders, and just looked at a whole bunch of different kind of older growth forms, like the one you see there with Gary standing below, as well as some of the disturbed forms in various ways that we've stewarded and used the land. And, you know, we spend a lot of time trying to just shift our view, right? You know, we spend a lot of time nowadays worrying about the future and with climate change and global uncertainty and all the things we're not going to get into here. But to really understand the future, you've really got to understand the past. And so, again, it's looking and changing. You know, we don't live a long time as a species. We're a pretty long-lived species, but still, you know, less than 100 years doesn't give us the perspective of ecology that lets us kind of truly see what happened here and the ways that we changed the landscape for good reasons. But if we don't know what we lost to, then we're just not fully seeing that equation. And that's kind of, you know, the McPhail's way is we're always working towards improving our ecological literacy. And it, again, doesn't mean knowing every species. It can mean looking at patterns and recognizing those, you know, and the greatest teacher is getting outside, you know, the plants and animals and the winds in your face, all of that is really the best way to engage and learn this stuff. But it's helpful to have other resources too. So again, I just posted some pictures there. Chris, we're going to include this in the booklet, and we'll talk about this a little bit next session a little more. But Chris is a provincial. It stands for Climate Hazard and Risk Information System, I think, Chris. And so it's a online portal you can go to, and you can go to your own property and look at various flood hazards and erosion and things like that. So great way to visualize somehow the way these coastal forces are have worked, are working, and might work in the future on your property. And then the one on the top is just that's our website. That's the planting guides page. So look at that. We've got planting guides for all these different areas. And we've even got one that says coastal. So, you know, there's all kinds of other resources you can look at to get some specific names. But again, working on recognizing these patterns on your own property really will bring a lot of joy and improve your work. And so, you know, in that spirit, I was thinking about how introspective it feels when you're doing good ecological work. You're out on a coast and you're looking closely at little leaves, you're thinking really hard about processes. And then I got to think, I was like, that's not introspection. Introspection, thinking about yourself, it's the opposite. And I was like, is there a word for that? And apparently, extrospection is a full on real English word. I didn't know that. But that's really what you're doing, right? You are thinking hard about things outside yourself, right? It's a form of empathy, an ecological empathy. You know, and so those are the skills that we're going to continue working on throughout this whole process, right? And so we've got these wonderful coastal species, and the cool thing about plants, I think one of the things I'm drawn to is one, they're stuck in place, so finding them is a little easier to do than animals sometimes. But the other thing too is their form tells you stories, right? So we've got these really cool plants that have burrs, right? That middle picture on the bottom there, that's a common name, rough cockle burr. That's the common name. It's a really quite a showy big plant with these big burrs, and they stick to you. They're kind of sticky and spiky, and so they catch on your leg, right? And they float. So double way of dispersal. It's a plant that can pick up onto a mammal or a person or a beachgoer, and also wash off into the ocean and float somewhere else. Really cool ways of getting around, right? You know, that seaweeds, they have those weird little bubble things on them, right? And those are floaters, right? Because that seaweed has experienced tides every day. Sometimes it's got 3 feet of water on top of it, and other times it's got no water. And so those floaters allow it to rise up to get more sunlight because it is a photosynthesizing species, right? When it needs to. And that weird star-shaped mushroom is a mushroom, for one. That's hard to tell from that picture. And it's really neat. When it's wet and younger, it curls up like a little ball. and it rolls around. And the spores, which are the mushroom equivalent of a seed, they sit inside the center of that ball. And as it dries, it will open those arms up and stretch out, releasing the spores. And so it's able to not only move from where it originally grew to go put those spores not just in one other place, but roll around like a tumbleweed and drop them all over the place. Um, but then the body itself will stop itself somewhere when it finds the right humidity level, right? To need those spores to be like, oh, it's time for you to start settling in, right? So there's these clues when we stop to look at shapes and watch things through its seasons. And, sometimes they're mixed with human histories. So that top picture there is near Clear Spring, so kind of the naufrage cliffs, I call them, kind of northeast from PEI, this really cool windblown spot. And we're going to talk about that spot a few times because it's taught me a lot. And, for instance, that was a farm field in the 1950s, abandoned maybe 1955 or give or take, and just grew back naturally, right? And I've seen other coastal windy spots like that, cliffs, um, that were farmed up until that point and just don't look as nice and as cool as that one and have the diversity of species. And they also lack this weird old road. The old road is actually not particularly used. There's no farmers up there. One time I was up there and a guy in a dirt bike with an axe on his back drove along it. It was a little scary at first, but he was very nice. But other than that, I've never seen anyone on that road but me. It's an old rum runner road. So that's from Prohibition times, back when this was a farm field. And those farmers maintained that road because that's how you got your rum. It was a very important road. And the cool thing about it, because they valued the road, because they valued rum, because it was illegal, and it was shipped in at night along these shores, they farmed only until the road, which meant that on the coastward side of that road is a little remnant refuge for all those weird coastal species that can tolerate these conditions that normally in a lot of other properties got farmed away. So weirdly, the prohibition movement helped conserve this kind of really amazing recovering coastal ecosystem that we have. And I don't find this quality of one in a lot of spots, but this whole coast where that road exists developed so much better because it had these seed sources, right? That one took me a little bit to figure out. So again, is this humble extrospection? It's a hard word to say, where you're trying to practice empathy. I have goals that I want to see happen, but I can think about all these disparate goals and strategies and adaptations, and they're going to help along what I want to do too, quite possibly. And so we're going to get more specific today. We're going to be talking about specific settings, right? Because we need to be able to recognize habitats are hard to categorize, but recognizing some of the similarities of settings, conditions, growing mediums, effects on different plants, that starts to tell you those stories again, right? So they can be really simple stories. That seaside plantain growing on the cliff there in the top right picture, it is a really cool succulent. It's very cactus-like when you feel the leaves because it grows in the highest wind, hardest perched, most salt sprayed and wave sprayed. Like it's just a terrible place to grow from a plant's perspective. And you can see that not much is growing on that cliff. It's always constantly eroding too. So even if you get growing, you're going to be washed up at some point. And I thought to myself, you know, I'll keep looking at cliffs and I'll find more species of PEI's wonderful bevy of diversity that are going to adapt to that spot. And honestly, not too many. It's a real specialist, right? And so those sparse cliffs, that's maybe just okay. And when I look at those on my property, I might not be trying to blanket them with vegetation because it just might not be how it works on that one. The picture below that spruce, um, it's burned by the wind. You can see the browning needles, right? And we tend to sometimes look at that, and with untrained eyes, you say, oh, no, damage. My spruce is hurt. I need to heal it. I need to protect it, right? And sometimes that's completely true. In that case, contextually, looking at that tree and the trees kind of out of focus behind it that are obviously highly crumbled, obviously highly bent in the wind with lots of dead pieces, this is a windy spot. And that amount of burning is actually a first degree burn, right? It'll heal. It's not a big deal. It's actually conditioning that tree to know where it's growing and to develop strength and more resiliency, right? There's a point where there's a tipping point. So I want to be able to look at the context of where my things are growing, what specific thing, how it's that spruce growing compared to the spruce next door, and starting to recognize what those species are telling me about different qualities and challenges I'm going to be facing on my property. And just a complicate, we're going to get complicated, guys. I'm sorry. Nature's complicated. Timing. We got to think about time now. We're going to today we're talking about habitats. We're going to talk about space a lot and how space, your own property and where things go and things like that. But time is always going to be a significant thing, right? Obviously, when we think of time, seasons come up real fast to us. Winter berry holly, as I show there, it makes its berries for the winter. They're not great berries. So things don't eat them earlier. They produce kind of late. And then you have these berries that end up persisting into the winter, and things will eat them once they're desperate enough. So great winter food, right? By not tasting good, you outlast everything else. And by being able to survive a freeze without totally falling apart, you are there at a time of year when nothing else is there. So you're going to get eaten, right? It's a great strategy. Um, but that's important for me to know if I'm looking at wildlife on my property. I want to think about, do I have food at all seasons and for all creatures that I know about that are here, right? And that's an impossible ask, but I can at least dream about it, right? Seasons can change the way we look at things too. The top two pictures on the left there is bayberry with its like cool little waxy tight to the stem berries, right? A plant we all know, or most of us will know, it's pretty common on PI, every ditch and hedgerow and coastline. And I know it really well. I've smelt it. I've made some small candles out of it. I plant it, I know it well. But I was out in my early coastal days on a dune in Cavendish in the winter with 3 feet of snow in the dunes. So just little tiny bits of stems and berries and things were poking up from the snowpack. And there was this little tiny stems, little weird berries pretty close to the stem, kind of frosted like that. And I thought, oh, maybe it's bayberry. And bayberry is like aromatic. It smells lovely and very specifically. And so I thought, oh, just smell this berry. Gary's always touch trees, smell things. So I crush up this berry and I snort it. I smell it. Um, Nothing, no smell. Did not smell like bayberry. And I was like, all right. So I walked away. And it wasn't until the car ride home where it hit me because these plants don't look like each other in the summer at all. But it was poison ivy. That's the plant on the right. They have little berries too, and they are kind of close to the stem. And I guess with a good frost and a good freeze and being bare above snow, they don't look a lot different from bayberry. Had I looked closer, I'm sure I could have figured it out. But I made that mistake, right? Luckily, no effect. I don't know if the berries were neutralized, but it's those kinds of things. So these things can change even to the trained eye. Seasons can confuse things, but we're going to be thinking about time, not just seasons. We're going to be thinking about time over decades too. But start with seasons. So again, we talked about shapes. They tell us lots of cool stories. Again, that spruce, windy spot. If I plant things there, they're going to be winded. That spruce is telling me the story, right? The honeysuckle, really gorgeous picture by Eric there. But that honeysuckle on the left, right? Even those flowers, they're telling us stories. We know that they're got nectar in them, and we know that they need a pollinator to come visit them, right? But that deep, deep flower, the nectar is usually located at the base of the flower. So when you have a long flower like that, it means something needs to get all the way through that long flower and get down there to get the nectar. And not everything can do that. So that flower shape is indicating that it's going to be some pollinators that have long somethings to get in to get the nectar. Long tongues, long proboscises, long beaks, right? And so it's telling me that maybe hummingbirds or bumblebees, which have particularly long bee tongues for bee species, right? It's certain pollinators it's aiming at, right? It's specializing in attracting those ones with its shape and its colors. And so we can learn to read those stories and think about, hey, honeysuckle is really important for hummingbirds, which migrate 4 or 5,000 kilometers and get back here right when honeysuckle goes into bloom, right? So maybe adding that into my forest is a great idea. So we can look at these shapes and they tell us stories too. And I know I'm going philosophical and other things as I often do, but again, we're working towards this idea of a cooperative stewardship, right? We, maybe the property owners, I don't own any property, but I get to walk all over but everybody else's. But really, when you start playing with the wild ecosystems and having this kind of ecological or restoration focus, you recognize that the other members of that community, the oaks, the bayberry, the marram, the spruce, they're playing roles and they're changing conditions and enacting changes. They're drawing in new animals, right? They are actually stewarding the land with you, right? And so you can enter into a cooperative agreement. Of course, you're going to mow some of them out of the way. You're going to build a deck. You're going to have a staircase going down the shore, right? But there's other areas where you can cooperate and actually tap into the power that they have, and they'll start making some decisions and taking care of some things that you don't have to worry about, right? So sometimes it's getting to know that community and seeing those roles and functions and kind of, sharing your interests with these creatures effectively, Do you like cooking and wild food? Well, a lot of these plants love making wild food, right? So there's a way for you to engage with this stuff. And the more you engage, the more you learn, and the more empathy, again, that you have for these systems and the way that you can use them. So yeah, we're talking about these communities, and communities are always about mutual kind of benefaction and resilience, working together, right? At least in the ideal form. And so our coastal communities, whether natural or whether human, which are also natural, but human, cultural, work really similarly, right? In PEI, that's a really hilarious map, I think, the animated map of Prince Edward Island. The use of the word animated there is funny. I guess maybe it's before they use the word cartoon, because like animated makes me think it should move. Anyway, that was made in 1929. Really cool map. There's all kinds of like silver foxes on it, which is really fun to see. The ferry from Cape Tormentine has a train attached to it, which is also really cool. Taking train loads over. There's some cool stuff in there. The story it tells me that I really like about it is that one, it's just this wild scape of communities, and also it's kind of like resource focused. Land use, really. It's got potatoes on it and so many more horses than we have nowadays. It's got a few cars, 1920s, so there are cars passing those roads, right? It's got little cows, pigs, those foxes, lots of fishing. And then you head into the ocean, it has even more stuff going on, right? Um, so it really shows you how we saw our land at that time. As much as it's a silly little map, right? It's showing you that relationship, right? But that interreliance, because not everybody's growing potatoes. Some people are, and they're feeding the other ones, and other people are doing other things, right? Um, Now, we are going to look at it a little closer because there's some weird things going on. These have nothing to do with coastal restoration. I'm very sorry. I got on a tangent. I looked at this map for like 10 minutes on my own while I was building this because look at that craziness. I don't know what those dudes are doing, the ones I highlighted. The guy on the right up near Surrey being chased by a fish. That's just funny. I get why they did that. I just wanted to highlight it. I like that. There's a golfer near Charlottetown, which it's just neat. In 1929, I just didn't think of golf courses and PEI being a thing. I don't know if that's like is it Kensington or Hillsborough Golf Course? Kensington Golf Course? Anyway, I'm not sure where I don't know what that is. But then the guys kind of starting in Kensington and going westward just get weirder. I don't know what they're doing. There's a guy dancing on a train. There's a guy like poking a beehive or has a chimney sweep, and then there's a guy with red socks and fishnet stockings. I can't tell. But I just thought it was worth a gander. You can Google this map. It's out there. Back to the real thing. Yeah, so we're looking at these community partnerships across our ecosystems, right? And so I like the picture of St. Peter's in the top right because it's like it's a old settled in the French age, the French settlement era, Mi'kmaq before that, of course. It's an old fishing village, right? That still exists, still vibrant, right? And it's so tight. Look at that little tiny pocket of like fishing villages all tight together, all nestled with a big church, right? And that's the same way our habitats work along our coasts. We rely on each other. You want your smithy and your tavern and your farmer and your church pretty close to each other because you're all relying on each other, right? So I also just put a picture of the book Pattern Language down there because it's a book about architecture and city planning from like 70s. Eric knows more about it than I do, but it's a that same conceptual idea where you're looking at those patterns between how we use place and how that engages our community. And just this time, we're not just thinking about humans, we're going to be thinking about all of these other creatures, whether they be blue herons or raccoons, right? And so that picture of Bedumagek National Park Reserve, I just kind of highlighted some of the habitats that are across that small bit of community, right? Um, those are the ones I named down there. We could be like low salt marsh, high salt marsh. The dune barrens could be broken up into bare sand and lichen covered territory and shrub covered territory, and that forest could be broken up into all kinds of other categories. But the main point is you break it up into a simple, often on PEI's land, all I have to do really is you can break it up into forest, field, coastal or wetland. And then maybe river, or something like that, or yard if you're doing landscaping, but you can use really broad categories. But the idea is just to start looking at that diversity and recognizing that those dune barrens and crumholes are letting that salt marsh exist, which is helping to slow the floodwaters and winds, letting that deciduous forest blossom, which is then protecting further inland areas and slowing erosion with roots in the ground. It's that interconnected process again. And so they are this mutual mosaic. And so sometimes when we want to do things on our coastal properties, and our provincial parks are really cool examples of this because they've had a long time doing awesome things with really good values, right? Getting people to the coast, giving a spot to engage and camp and explore our wonderful coastlines, providing like recreation and learning, all kinds of cool stuff, right? But some of that's been done with a cost because it's broken up that mutual mosaic. When we colonize or settle or disturb whole areas because we decide this is now RV camping or this is now a beach for public use, or this is a potato field, right? Then we disrupt that mosaic, and those coastal forces intrude, and the habitat will adjust sometimes to our own kind of lamentation or unexpectedness. So the kind of series of old aerial photos, that's Cedar Dunes Provincial Park. And this mosaic, one of the things about it is we don't understand how it works. We understand parts of it, but if you look at that Cedar Dunes shoreline, so the orange kind of boundary across all the pictures is it's the modern day property line. It looks like it was probably like actually made in 1990 when it matched the shore, but it's the legal property line of that park. And so it never changes. It's like the same location all the time. And it's the landscape and the shoreline that is shifting and growing and shrinking in various ways over the decades, right? But you can actually see that in 1935, we had less shoreline in some ways than in 1990. But now in 2023, we have less than we had in both of those. So we made changes either prior to 1935 or afterwards, probably afterwards, that started to shift the way sand deposited, which meant that we actually accreted sand onto that beach. And then we change something else, or maybe somewhere up the coast. I don't know what caused the latest. It could just be increased storms, right? That's the thing. There's so many variables in that. It's hard to explain, but we do have the resources sometimes to look at it and be aware of the change, even if we can't explain all the reasons. Um, you know, but that's lowering the resiliency for the rest of that cedar forest. And that last picture really shows you that because if you look at 2010, right after we had Juan and other hurricanes before that that probably caused coastal flooding, in 2010, the coastal flooding and the coastal flooding was weak enough, I guess, or the shoreline was still intact enough, right? That the coastal flooding didn't reach to those inland cedars, that forest at the back. But in that 2023 picture, you can see the brown smear starting kind of concentrated in the western part of the property towards the coast, but then kind of darting inwards. That's the coastal flooded area where salt waters breached those roads and couldn't escape and caused those cedar to die. It's a really big area, right? And that didn't happen after Juan, but it did, and it didn't happen after Dorian, but it did happen after Fiona. And yeah, Fiona was more powerful, so I'm not saying that could be the reason, but I'm guessing it's a bit more complicated. The Jacques Cartier picture on the lower left-hand corner just shows you that rock armoring attempt, right? And that is rock armoring again has a goal. It's performing a function just like our dune systems and our crumholts and our mature coastal forests. So I'm going to speak a bit poorly about it because it's not my favorite solution to these problems because it's a one-sided solution. It's there to combat erosion. That is it. It doesn't make pollinator habitat, right? It doesn't eventually make a forest and make habitat for cool owls. It's not slowing coastal waters particularly well, right? And it needs to be maintained. And it actually then disperses the erosion that it's stopping and puts it towards the properties next door where the rock armoring ends. So it is functionally doing something, and that's why we choose to do it. And there are times where we need a quick solution. But as far as a long-term solution, as far as a self-sustaining solution, and as far as one that comes with these host of other benefits, many of which we don't fully understand, these rock armoring attempts will not be as successful, not be as productive, and ultimately do some effects along our coasts that we don't actually even understand. So I keep using the word habitat. And again, we're going to, as we get more specific, we're going to face a bit more jargon and a bit more of these things, but I'm always going to try to bring it back to the process, bring it back to the patterns that are important, right? And really, when we say the word habitat or some of this stuff, right, it's very blurred. When you get into the science of categorizing habitats, ecologists still argue about everything because it's very wiggly. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is areas of similar conditions and with similar communities, right? And sometimes when we add time into the matrix, we can think of areas with similar conditions, and the communities may not be the same right now, but if we give it 50 years and the right seed sources, they would end up likely being very similar because of those conditions, right? So when we're thinking about our habitats and when you're thinking about your own property, when I say habitats, it could be yard. The conditions of your yard and the community of your yard are similar, right? And it is not the community isn't a forest community. It's a community of deck goers and maybe your dog and whoever else, right? So that's a fair thing to call a habitat from a stewardship angle, from a landscaping angle, from a restoration angle, right? And we can figure out where the compromise is between all the community members, potential, and the ones that actually live there. Um, so, you don't have to turn your backyard into a forest, but maybe we can think of some cool shrubs. Maybe we can think of some birds we could attract. Maybe we could add a bird house or whatever else, or a compost pile. So when we look at that first picture in the upper left, that's that cool Clear Spring coast I told you with that cool rum running road. And you can really see these distinct areas, right? You can see that shaped trees, that forest, that Krumholtzing forest. You can see them get more upright at the back, right? You can see the front where it's not mowed, it's just so winded. Nothing grows higher than a few inches, right? We can even see some areas of shrubs, as well as the coastal habitats, right? And so that one has nice, clear, almost ordered pattern just because of the overpowering wind, right? The dune picture there from Greenwich, kind of middle top, labeled complex and dynamic, right? That's like a mosaic of close-knit habitats because even though you're only meters apart or tens of meters, the difference between where the water pools and the top of that dune, those conditions change drastically, right? And the communities that form in those conditions are also going to change. So we can call that a dune system. That's a habitat name, but really that's referring to a mosaic of subhabitats of dunes, right? So sometimes that's all we need to know, right? We can put dune system and we can guess there's going to be some wet areas and some dry tops. We don't need to necessarily label or map out all of the things, right? Um, Other spots, the middle picture there below the dunes is a coastal bog, and so it's vast and it's pretty uniform from our scale. So when I look across that or we look at that picture, it's just all flat. It's, covered in all these acid-loving plants. Bogs are known for their acidic soils. It's the dominating kind of factor that overtakes that area. But if we were to crawl around, which I've done in there, there's orchids and carnivorous plants and little tiny, tiny mosses and all kinds of diversity just at a much smaller scale. And they're all specialists who can survive that really acidic growth, right? So sometimes when we think they're vast or uniform, or we think they're complex or dynamic, they can be both at once, right? But honing in on those things and saying, okay, with that vast uniform thing like a bog, I could wish I could build there, but trying to change those conditions in that vast place overpowered by acidity is going to be really, really tough. So sometimes it's being aware of what the driving force is that is making those habitats and how much you can alter that, how expensive to maintain that's going to be or to do, right? So when we're thinking about habitats, we're going to use some different jargon and some titles, and we're going to talk about different parts of the dunes and those kinds of things. But really, we're trying to think about their important functions, what forces are opposing each other or overtaking each other. We're going to think about the habitats that are particularly ecologically rare on PEI or sensitive, right? And how we can protect or at least not damage those ones, right? And of course, with your own properties, we're going to be dealing, and I know there are lots of places on PEI, we're going to be dealing a lot with disturbed and domesticated places. And these have, again, this is where your habitat has been disrupted. And so there is shared conditions, and there is a potential community that wants to live there. But sometimes figuring out which one it is can be a little more challenging because you may not have quite as many clues, right? So the diagram on the left is I came up with this 15 minutes before this presentation. It just popped into my head and I made it. So it might be wrong. I'm not saying it's right, but just one way to think about it is like if you have mature habitats, remember PEI was 98% forested. If you've got a mature, undisturbed habitat in PEI and everything's kind of middle ground, you're inland, nothing's too wet, too salty, too acidic, or too sandy, you got a forest, right? And as you shift towards those, as those become the dominating kind of conditional factors, notice I don't have wind there. We could make a star out of this. Again, 15 minutes before this, I didn't have time for stars. Um, but yeah, so as you drift towards, if wet starts to dominate, the forest will become a swamp forest. But if there's too much wetness, trees can't even survive that. So then you start having marshland, right? If you head towards that acidic corner, as you head there from a forest kind of normal mature system on PEI, you would have a wooded bog, lots of bog trees and things, some stunted. And as you got more and more acidic, eventually so acidic the trees can't reach their full height, and you have an actual low, flat, vast, uniform bog, right? So same thing with that dune system, same thing with salts. We could throw in wind, we could throw in other variables depending on what we think is maybe either cooperating or dominating on that ecosystem. They all care about light, they all care about water. All of these systems matter, but sometimes one, like a bog or a dune, will have such an overwhelming force of the growing medium or force of the acidity or force of just pooling water that starts to dominate the system. Yeah, so some of the areas we're going to look at, we're going to just start right next to the sea. So, as we all know, I'm not going to go deep into it because this is probably pretty good information that people already know. We have tides powered by the moon and sun, but moon primarily follows those cycles, right? So these are tides that come in and out, right? So where your property is closest to the shore, as you already probably are very aware of, your tide shifts depending on where you live. If you're along the very exposed northern shore, it probably won't shift too much. If you're in an estuary or somewhere sheltered or the south shore, you'll have much more tide variation throughout the day. Now, you could set up cameras, you could stare at it. If you live there full time, you might already be pretty aware of those patterns of how far inland does it come? How far out does it go? But if you don't know those things, or if you're on a new beach somewhere, you can use the seaweeds, the racks, as they're sometimes called, right? Wherever they get deposited is the last tide. So you can start looking at where there's remnant seaweeds that are dried up high that lets you know that sometimes it gets all the way up there, right? And wherever that kind of middle, you can see the rack line shifts over the cycle. And towards the lower end of the rack line and beyond is your foreshore. It's heading into the water, very marine dominated. And heading to the back of your rack line and up towards your inland habitat would be your backshore, which sometimes is still very barren and marine dominated, like along our cliffs. Sometimes is incredibly vegetated, like our salt marshes. Most of the salt marsh could be considered a very long, vast backshore, right? Sometimes they're pretty barren, like a dune system. There are a bunch of dune plants that grow along the backshore, but depending on the severity of the winds, the dryness of the sand, and how many tourists visit that beach, you can have a pretty barren backshore. And on dunes, sometimes you won't even have much of a rack line just because of those crazy conditions. But again, they're all just telling you stories. So these are meeting places, right? Our coastal habitats and our properties between those marine forests and those inland habitats. And so this first line is where you start to kind of draw lines, right? And one thing we tend to try to do on PEI sometimes is think of our backshore as our first line of defense. Um, it is, in a sense, but the problem with the backshore on most habitats is it's really, really not just hard to plant in, very specific species often not woody and often hard to get for free, and weirdly grown by places like McPhail's. But the other issue with it too is they are temperamental. So you can do all this effort and money and sweat and plants into a backshore area and you get a bad storm that fall and it all comes off, right? Same with our cliffs. So there's a lot of risk in that. So often it's best to try to work on the inland adjacent area where you can be sure that it has a bit of time to establish whatever plantings or things you do there before the waves and winds truly hit it strongly. Dunes. So dunes are a whole kind of system, habitat type with subhabitats. Now, none of you should probably own a dune. I don't believe you can own the dunes on PEI. All of them are considered official wetlands, so they are protected areas. The reason I like to talk about them is because you might have sandy areas that aren't quite dunes. Instead of primary dunes, I call them sub-primary dunes. Um, but the other reason is because many of you might live near a dune system where it is actually doing roles in sheltering your property and the health, the power, the expanse, and how much it's hurt by tourism and other activities is actually can have a huge effects on your own property. So dunes, we're not going to go deep into them because I don't think you guys will be out needing to restore your dunes, but they are amazing habitats that it's worth knowing just a few things about what they're doing, the special species that live there. So that dune picture, the big one, is from Tracadie Island. It's a really awesome little island of sand, super magical, super beat up, but also really healthy. It's a funny combo. It's battered all the time, so part of it is supposed to be beat up. You can see where like waves broke another primary dune, and now there's just this like right beside where I have the primary dune marked on the right of that. There's just like a gap, right? That's a flooding event that happened and just moved sand drastically, right? And now there's going to be a little sometimes semi-salt marsh there, which is great. There's supposed to be Gulf St. Lawrence aster, which grows in salt marshes out on that island. So that's like more habitat for that, right? Someone's going to take advantage of the disturbance event. But yeah, you can see some of the different areas. This one's got a bit of everything. It's got this primary dune that's massive, right? And that's the first dune, right coast side. Their sized denotes how long they've since disturbance, but the other thing is that it takes wind to drive sands to go up that tall. So in low wind settings, your sand dunes do not get as tall. So that is a response. That thing is building itself in response to the average winds so that it has the structural size and intensity to deal with high wind events. It's a clever amount of engineering, and none of that sand or wind thinks. It's just done that through years of practice process, right? And plants are involved in that whole too. So the primary dune really, it's epic, it's amazing. I don't want them to get hurt, but they are meant to take the blast. That's what they're there for. That's their job. So you can see in the right hand picture at the top, that's Blooming Point sand dunes, and that's the primary dune after Fiona. It's like 20 plus meters of loss. You can even see the hard packed sandstony soils forming below the dunes from so much weight on them, old dune soils that are getting compacted, bayberry roots sticking out of that. But it's okay. That's okay. That's like it's now looks drastically different a few years later, like way more like a normal dune again. They are meant to take that blast every so often. They do it for the team because they're protecting those yellow dunes and those potential gray dunes and those swales and those dune forests behind them, the ones that are stabilizing a little more. They're giving them a chance to, right? So the yellow dunes are generally covered with marams, drier, younger. You've got bayberry, all kinds of things, lots of shrubs in there. Your gray dunes are much, much rarer. The ones on Trackety Island, there's just a few patches of them, and I don't know if they're developing or whether they're old ones that have just been reduced to small patches. It's hard to say. I'm on the end of they're probably remnants more than they're young. But I'd love for them to be new spreading patches of gray dunes because that's an older successional dune system once you get some stability. And the dune
And
swing.
quick
Yes.
question. Can you estimate the average wind speed just based on the dunes and the dune size, primary?
We're going to talk about estimating wind speed from the trees a little bit more. I've never looked into anything that told me how to do it from dune size, but yeah, definitely the dune size. Like if you're in an area with giant dunes, you've got high wind speeds generally, and if you're in a low dune area, much lower wind speeds. So it's a good qualitative indicator, but yeah, I don't know how to actually equate it to proper wind speed. But I'm also not a very good. Sometimes I'm not a numbers guy, and if you're like 10 meters per second, I'm like, okay. Sure. Is that gusty? I'm not sure. That's quite gusty. It's very gusty, 10 meters per second. I've learned that since I wouldn't have known that, right? Like that's, numbers mean, but if you're like, whoa, man, it's really windy. Um, Dune swales are really cool. They're like wetlands on wetlands. And they've got, oh, a heart floated by. That's nice. Um, and anyway, they hold some crazy stuff. Sometimes they're salty, but surprisingly, because of dune sand's high filtration and the fact that they're actually fed by rainwater, um, often means that they're actually like fresh. So you'll find like orchids and sphagnum mosses and frogs and really weird stuff in the middle of a dune. It's like they're very unique and very cool. Again, don't go romping around the dunes, but if ever you do, or someone lets you, or you get special permission like I did, explore them because they're really cool. Now, a lot of you are going to live along what we refer to as a cliff. I know all of those pictures are like epic cliff pictures. They're like tall and, cool. Um, Many of you, if you're 1 meter off the ground near the shore, that's a cliff or a bluff. Just for category's sake, let's keep it simple. If you're really low rolling into the shore, that's a low plain, right? There's slight differences, but any cliff is where you have some elevation and a bit of a vertical or relatively vertical drop off. Um, Bluffs are usually I refer to like that unconsolidated slumping cliff where it's not so much sandstone sheer walls, but you're actually got this slump of materials that usually erode a lot faster, but also are less vertical, and you'll have more tufts of grass or even full sods with shrubs attached to them slide halfway down and then take root for a few years until another storm blasts them off. But the cliffs are the soils can vary, although honestly, usually they're pretty medium. I don't see a lot of cliffs that are pure sand or a lot of cliffs that are pure clay. So they usually just kind of fall under a pretty normal island soil. With a slight bit more water retention sometimes because there's bedrock, like sandstone, directly underneath the soils. It's like thinner soils, maybe. But the main thing you're thinking about is wind and coastal forces. If you're on a cliff, especially if you're really exposed, you're getting not only the full brunt of those coastal forces, but the fact that you're higher up, especially if you're on a tall cliff, means you're in higher winds. I don't just mean higher winds like more elevated, I mean like more powerful winds. Um, Wind is moves the speed across land and water, and the lower winds, lower elevated winds, um, are slower because there's more friction happening on them as they skid against the water and the trees and the grass. Whereas as you move up into our atmosphere, the winds get speedier because there's just less things rubbing on them. So when you're up on a cliff, you're getting higher, like someone nearby you in similar winds at a lower elevation would just feel less wind, and their plants and properties would too. So when you're thinking about cliffs, you're often in a place where you're fully exposed, really, maybe high up and are getting blasted by winds. And that effect, depending on the power, can range really far into your property or not at all. The picture there is Cameron Island, which is located near Point Prim. Really cool seaside fog that you see once in a while in these cliff sites that actually is like a huge source of moisture and water for these plants and animals. But you can see there's some deformed trees near the edge of the cliff. But as soon as you get a little bit inland from there, the trees are pretty darn upright and regular growing, right? So there is a coastal Krumholtzing force, but it doesn't reach very far inland because it's just not quite that powerful consistently. Powerful enough to, make some to be noticed, but not something to worry strongly about. The last picture there is just, there's other hidden stories, always, always, always. And that one is just those different bands of color that you see in our sandstone, right? That's all sand that was in soils that were deposited millions and millions of years ago, back during the Permian Age, when we were like a desert system with monsoonal centuries. So basically, the iron in our soils, for iron to rust, you need oxygen. So the red soils are showing you times where we were dry and there was lots of oxygen for our iron to rust. And then we got flooded and we're actually underwater for various chunks of time in the distant past. And that's the white bands because it's those same soils, but the iron in them did not rust because it was in water where the oxygen doesn't let it. There's oxygen, but it's not available. Anyway, learn more about that with Prehistoric Island Tours, PI Museums. They've got some really great tours, hands-on learning, and then cool writings and blog posts and stuff. So you can always look that up if you're into going into the weird stories of pests, which I like. They're fun. Let's do them. Another big kind of grouping of habitats are our coastal wetlands. They're not always salty. Often, we tend to think of coastal wetlands and we immediately go right to salt marshes, and that's great. Salt marshes are hugely important, very coastal, incredibly productive habitats. They huge job in slowing coastal erosion, or sorry, coastal flooding. So they do other things too, don't get me wrong. But that would be as far as when you're thinking about coastal risk along the coast, the coastal salt marshes really filter and slow floodwaters. Really important for it. Super productive habitats across the board for a bunch of animals and stuff. All of these wetlands, if you have one, um, should be officially protected unless the government just doesn't know they're there, which sometimes wetlands get missed, right? So if you do have an area that is wet, or a wetland, whether it be a river, a bog, a freshwater wetland, or a salt marsh, right? And you can figure out whether you can talk to people in the government, and if it's not marked, you can get it marked, which gives it some protections and things like that. But they're really important areas. Anywhere where you have extra water means you've got extra niches, extra habitat. Water is the source of life, so you're just going to suddenly have a boom of diversity. It's amazing as soon as you have a coastal river hitting that ocean, just a bevy of weird communities joining. So again, going back to that habitat diagram, as the forces oppose and fight each other and fresh water overpowers salt and they mix together in those transitional zones, you just get this real diversity of stuff, right? There's a few other rare types of bogs. If you live in Western PEI, like Prince County, you might have a coastal bog. That's where they are usually. I'm not saying there's none others. I've seen a few others around PEI, but much less common. Western PEI is wetter and boggier. Um, so you might have a low-lying coastal bog. I put the picture of the perched coastal bog. That's from North Cape. It's the only one I really know about. Not to say there's no others, and it's just a fabulous place with walking trails, the big giant wind turbines. It's like worth going to see. It's super windy, awesome. It's like a giant wetland perched on the top of very tall cliffs right beside the ocean. Very weird mixture, but it can show you that complexity of forces and communities interacting, where our habitat definitions start to break a little bit. Now, another category, not a distinct habitat per se, but sharing similar land uses and paths and challenges moving forward. Again, that's why I group it like this, as their settled shores. And these could be on cliffs, like the ones there from Cameron Island again, or they could be in a swamp. It could be along a dune, right? We can disturb pretty much whatever we want. We're really good at it. So these come with their own things. So most likely, whatever property you're looking to restore, your own, had some level of disturbance, right? If not, awesome. That's lucky, and rare. But it probably has, right? So being aware of those, and thinking about what those do to your coast is really important. So those pictures, again, Cameron Island, I'm going to use that one a few times. It taught me a lot too. Um, the I got them kind of out of order because the bigger picture just felt like it should go on top. But the lower picture is pre-Fiona. So that is just like the summer before Fiona hit. And you can see that same cliff line, um, with more upright trees. And particularly at the point on the right-hand side, there's like a crumholes. Not like an intense one, but there is a jumble of gnarly trees there. Um, and if you notice in the picture above, it's the main chunk that survived. So all the trees that had been fiercely windblown their whole lives develop resiliency to strong winds, and thus came through Fiona, and all those little copses survived, whereas those other ones that were growing more traditionally upright, because this isn't a high wind island. It's a medium, moderate wind island. So most of them were like, I don't grow that strong a wind, and then they get hit by a surprisingly strong wind. So sometimes, weirdly, it's our moderate and weaker shores that are more susceptible to hurricane or post-tropical storm or those strong wind event damages because those species haven't developed that resiliency. So that's where shifting that perspective, if you do have gnarled shrubs or gnarled trees somewhere on your property, those might be some of your strongest resilient species and maybe even oldest lived. So, seeing those in different lights is really important. Um, you're going to be faced with poor protection. The top picture on the right there is a picture from Cedar, no, Jacques Cartier. And that's where if you look, they've rock armored that because they said, oh, we're eroding quickly because we have poor protection. So they stopped a symptom, which is erosion. The poor protection, which is the causal effect, is still not been addressed. We've actually gone and planted some of that area. So it's getting addressed. But that's allowing flood waters and all kinds of things to come through, right? And they're scared of planting that area. Not scared. There's a road already there. That's the bathroom, that building, right? So they're going, oh, well, that's really expensive to change all that infrastructure. That was very expensive to set up in the first place. And we didn't leave enough room for trees and stuff, or the room we left is eroded away and we don't have enough anymore. And I get that that's a big cost, but not having that protection just really means that building is going to get damaged in a storm soon. You're going to pay more eventually to dispose of the wreckage and then replace and then rebuild. So it's one of those things where you just kind of go, okay, there's ways to adjust, to try to compromise, and it will actually work out in a beneficial in the long term. Yeah, so when there's harsh uses, you sometimes will have harsh lessons. Those are some trees I did plant with the Parks Canada, and they all died. But the shrubs and the wildflowers all survived. That's why we did a diversity. This was the first test pilot Krumholtz planting, and I honestly thought most of them were going to die. We put them in anyway. It was a test, and they did. The ones further back survived better. Um, so you learn things. And growing in the wind is a whole process. We could talk about it forever, but understanding the pressures the wind puts on, because that's going to be one of your dominating forces along the coast. Um, so again, that's a great picture of Eric looking at this. It's a Campbell's Cove campground, and there's this one gnarly spruce. There's other ones, but this just, I like, it really shows you this tree has worked hard to live as long as it has, and it's still living, it's still growing, it's doing its job. It just doesn't look the best, but that's just, it had a tough life, right? And this effect, right, happens across our coasts in various forms. And so that kind of middle picture, you've got like a little hidden spruce seeking shelter, it's called, right? That's where I started to notice the best, youngest spruce on these sites were often growing amongst the shrubbery, hidden amongst the grasses. The ones out in the open were suffering, right? So using these patterns in this shelter or creating it ourselves with logs or berms or whatever other things. These are the strategies we're going to try to adapt from nature, right? And again, sometimes it's not mowing. That little forest path at the top, that goes out, and I was on this piece of public land, and that goes out to like a cottage property thing. But in 2020, during the COVID times, the cottage owners didn't go there. So so they didn't mow. And when I went in and looked at that yard, that was all mowed that year, but the next year wasn't. It was all spruce trees. They were mowing spruce trees. Like there was grass, but like I'd say like 90% of the ground space was spruce trees because that's just what is trying to grow there. And so, again, they don't have to plant anything. They just have to stop doing something and they could actually restore a whole bunch of that. And as this develops over time, those are balsam fir in the bottom picture. So again, another evergreen species still able to tolerate those winds, but now something else is changing because the spruce above it got old enough to change and slow winds, provide shade, increase humidity, change conditions, succeeding into a different kind of habitat. Um, think okay. I'm gonna try to speed through the rest because I know I'm almost at the supposed to be limit. I thought I was going all right at speed, but apparently time flies. This is just a really quick video. This is a live tree on Trackety Island. It took a few years ago. Most of it's dead, but there are pieces of it alive. It's still doing all of its jobs. It's still holding soil. And just to give you an idea, it's really hard for us to imagine. They're stuck there all the time, all day, no matter the storm. in the winter, all the weather. This is what they're dealing with. So this is a summer windy day. Might be loud because there is audio. I don't know how this works on this thing, so just in case, headphones, be careful. So yeah, so that's every day. And then in the winter, add in ice crystals that are sharp and cut you. Um, it's a tough life, right? So that tree is protecting others behind it, but you can see the greenery at the back of it where the winds don't hit quite as hard, right? Its whole form is building to have like six needles in the back. It just takes a lot of scaffolding to do it. And when you let that kind of effect continue onwards, that's where we get crumholds, right? So we're not going to spend too much time today looking at crumholds or those wind effects like that Grigg-Putnam index deformity. But we are going to use that later when we're assessing our own properties, right? To take a guess at those wind speeds. And that's when someone asked that question about the dunes, saying, hey, can you look at the size of a dune and guess the wind speed? Maybe. That's a really neat idea. And I want to ask people now. But someone, because they wanted to know where to cheaply put wind farms based on looking at gnarly trees, starting in the 1930s and continuing on to the 1970s, this Griggs Putnam team figured out that maybe we can site wind farms. I don't even know what their conclusion on the wind farm siting is. But what they did conclude was there is a pattern of deformity that happens based on wind speed. And when you have really weak speeds at index 0, you have a normal tree as we see them. And at index 7, where you just have constantly blasting winds, the trees will grow in a carpeting fashion, it's called. And they'll bend right over and form a carpet, which we do have on PEI. Rarely, but it happens, right? So you have all this thing, and it will happen at smaller scales, individual scales, and then landscape scales, where you can see that's like a little 3D mock-up of the coast I made. And it's just that effect happening for kilometers of the coast, right? That's where the winds are so strong, that coastal effect that we'll see is ranging 500 meters inland. I haven't measured it, but something like that. And this is a small process that's happening individually on these little buds. Those pictures at the bottom are spruces. You can see those fresh buds coming out. Their scales are breaking, which are their protective coating, and the rest of them are just fresh. And if sand or wind hits them now, it dries them out, it kills them, it cuts them, right? And this happens in the winter too, even when they're protected. And you can see the dieback in the picture on the right, right? So that death is part of the cycle of resisting these strong forces along our coast. And when you see it in some of your plantings, that's that contextual ability to go, is this bad death or is this acceptable death? Which, a funny term. And if you let it age long enough, right, we get to that coastal forest that I love, Padumagic Island. I'm going to find more of these. I don't know if they exist, but it's just incredibly diverse, right? And so there's so many more species that start to join as we let it age, get more complex. And again, that could be small sections of your property. It could be a coastal forest you own, or it could be a cool hedgerow you're playing with, right? And just those pictures at the top, the moderately disturbed, lightly disturbed, and heavily disturbed, that's describing both how much humans use that woodland, but also how much Fiona affected it. And it's funny that they line up. Lightly disturbed woodlands, where humans have done less harvesting, less bulldozing, and less planting of weird things, came through Fiona on the whole, and this is anecdotal, but I've been to a lot of spots on PEI, pretty lightly disturbed. The kind like I chop, Eric's a much better chainsawyer than I am, but I also chainsaw. And that's the woods you walk into and you go, all right, I could do this. Right. The one on the left, the moderately disturbed, if they're like maybe used for patch cutting and heavy harvests, but not like clear cutting, that kind of thing. Those tended to get a little bit more damage because there's holes in them in some areas and younger stuff and older stuff. And again, you walk in and you go, "Ooh, this is going to be a lot of work with my chainsaw." You're not defeated. It's going to be hard. And it's that final one, the heavily disturbed, where it's like an old field, grew up an old spruce or maybe a plantation, right? Like the one below it. Bad soils, maybe a monoculture, fast growing trees that aren't very strong, right? Those ones went down hard. And those are the ones where even with a good chainsaw, you're like, I want to cry and give up. It's a lot of work and it's dangerous work, right? And so that was just really clear after Fiona. And we saw this in our coastal properties last time too, right? Where when we let these places be diverse and strong and old, and they have a healthy community, right? They come through these events so much better. They fulfill their services better, right? And it's not just an island thing. These coastal habitats, I got a real quick chance, one trip. I've taken several trips, but one paid trip to research these places. I know I'm complaining about one paid trip to Cape Breton. Oh, poor Dan. But went to look at some crumholts up in the north of Cape Breton. So I went to like one of the northernmost points of Cape Breton, this cool place, Cape St. Lawrence. There's a lighthouse called Phantom Point Lighthouse. It's supposed to have a ghost. There were signs saying, "Watch out for bull." I did not see a bull, but apparently there's a wild bull out there that's left over from farming days. The coolest thing about this coast is it's so similar. It's got real rocks. The cliffs are different. There's lots of differences. It's more exposed and windier, so it's even more pronounced. But so many of the similar species, and then even more. And the cool reason why there's more is Cape Breton has a few species we don't have. But the main reason is because the rocks, they didn't plow this. It got settled at one point in the past, just like our land, but they couldn't dig into the soil very easily. It wasn't worth farming. So they grazed chunks of it, right? They forested, they went in and cut trees. So there's these remnants of ground plants that I don't see in our coastal forests very often. But the fact that they're growing in this even windier spot starts to give you hints that, whoa, 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 I bet they did, right? So really cool lessons to learn and great places to visit that can inspire you for your own property too. And now I like plants. I'm a botanist more than I am a zoologist. It took me a while to get to that word. But we got to talk about the animal community. There's a whole bunch of them, tons of animals. And they're all doing services and playing roles and have a chance to have that space. So there's like our iconic ones like blue heron. There's surprising ones like pileated I saw once on the coast, which is a pretty rare, large kind of crow, raven-sized woodpecker. Snakes love warming along our dunes and other warm spots where the soils get hot and they can stay out of the winds. There's even nests, ground nesting hawks and owls that nest in these places, and then our obvious mammals and stuff. So many of our animals are nocturnal. We don't notice them, but they're all need food. So it's, helpful to provide it. But then the cool thing about providing food, like those high bush cranberry, is that birds eat them and then they poop them in other places and plant them for you. So animals have the jobs and they're doing these tasks too. And you can kind of like trick them into doing a bunch of labor for you. It's slow and you don't pick where anything goes and you don't know what's happening for a few years, but eventually you'll see the effects. And our plants are doing the same thing, right? So they are providing services. So again, we're talking about these categories of habitats and stuff, but we can think about our plants in categories of what functions and services are they fulfilling? Are they mainly there as soil stabilizers? Are they pollination specialists, right? Are they nitrogen fixers? Are they really structural shelter that's providing shade and slowing winds? Are they absorbing floods, right? So breaking down some of our goals and our habitats and our species and our communities in these different ways in our heads lets us make our plans kind of consistently with our goals, but also while honoring kind of their roles naturally. And we're going to get deeper into these like weird charts I made next time. But this is a landscape level effect. So again, we looked at that Cedar Dunes. We've looked at a whole bunch of spots where changes along the coast change things for other people along the coast, right? But these patterns happen at all these different scales. And so we can mimic them. And mimic them lets us either select the right species for a weird spot or maybe find the spot that we need to for a species that we love. Maybe your grandmother loved ash trees and you want to plant one in her honor, right? Well, finding out where that ash tree is going to fit on your coastal property might be of value to you, right? So there's different ways to approach that. We don't have to just stick to these species that are on these lists, but knowing these conditions and these habitats lets us kind of play with that recipe in different ways. So back to Cedar Dunes, pretty much near the end, I swear. So thank you for being patient with me. Um, I'm not going to talk about erosion with Cedar Dunes because we already looked at that, but you can just see how, there are so many ways we could break up this big, giant, disparate property with wild cedar dune areas and campgrounds and all kinds of stuff. But, at the end of the day, when we were making this plan, we just kind of looked at it and we just thought about a balance between the uses and the ecologies, right? So that coastfront area, it's heavily used. Um, so we named it the coastfront area because again, it's providing ecological services, but it's also being disturbed. And so just differentiating where our goals are going to change, where communities might change. Even both of those Cedar Dune sections, one is right now under major susceptibility to more coastal flooding and other issues from the coast, while the other one remains pretty protected. So again, just differentiating those areas lets me target my resources into the one that needs help first, right? Or if I decide that one is lost to me now, I could just target into my long-term investment, right? I can make those choices, but just being aware. So again, as my dad would always do, you can basically do any of this with a napkin on a kitchen table and a pen. But this is something where just having these kind of mental maps or areas or habitat or categories, and again, I'm not trying to define which ones you use, but thinking about that balance is really, really helpful in your planning process. And thinking about the risks they're going to be facing in the future, thinking about the conditions they're facing right now, or planning out your next planting, right? So Cedar Dunes is this really great example because you have areas that are kind of wild, areas that are kind of settled and disturbed, areas that are under threat, areas with rare species, even. It's a real mixture. We've got invasive species there. There's the beautiful flower, the purple loosestrife. Gorgeous plant, terrible species for our marshlands, right? You even have some Krumholtzing species, although the effect doesn't range very far inshore because it's a relatively calm coast comparatively. So it's a really cool example. And again, we're going to be out planting there. So come on out and you get a chance to see some of all of this process in action. And so just, the last two slideshows I know have been broad and maybe not specific about actions. We're going to get into those in the next two. But just building, this is a bit of a garish map I made today. But what I did was I just took a bunch of the layers, like of, what coastal types, those red boundaries along the edges of the island there represent the cliffy areas, whereas the areas where it's green or swamps, low plains and salt marshes. And then I have the forest cover and then wetland cover, and then I threw wind speed as a gradient in there. So it's really complicated to look at, and honestly, a bad map as far as clarity goes. But just to give you, I don't even have soil drainage in there or land use history. But there's just so many variables that create this mosaic of PEI and especially our coasts. So kind of thinking about how these additive processes where you go, okay, I got high winds, I'm on a cliff. Ooh, I get hurricanes. And what happened to my land in the past? Putting those things together will start to give you hopefully a less garish and less complex little map of your own property and start letting you separate those areas out and start making goals and plans to build that coastal community on your own property. So next time we're going to be getting to work, talking about sustaining our shore. We're going to be looking, I still have to build this whole slideshow, so I can't tell you what's perfectly in it, but we're going to be looking at kind of simplifying some of this information down to an assessment rubric for you that you can use on your own property. We're going to be looking at planning and strategies to implement for different issues, as well as good ideas for plantings, like as far as some strategies you could use. And then the next one after that, we'll be going through some continuing on that kind of hands-on, what species to use, where to put them, things like that. Um, yeah, and just to remind you again, webinar series, if you're already registered, you know about that. Community planning's coming up. Those are all the dates. You can find all more information on our websites. And thank you so much for letting me go over time.
Thank you, Dan. Are there any questions?
I'm still screen sharing. Stop sharing. It's all right if there's no questions. I just explained it all perfectly. You can also, again, email, give a call, have a think over. I know that was another semi-philosophical one on some fronts, but hopefully that, it's again, we're trying to overview a lot of different disparate landowning habitats. So, um,
It's so important though to understanding what happens when you do plant something. So I think that's the confusion that often confronts landowners is like, well, I planted this species that should do well on the shore, and it's not. It's understanding the complexity of what you're actually dealing with. It helps you to anticipate the outcome and anticipate a different outcome than you would normally encounter inland. So, for example, like just that insight about like trees will experience dieback on along the shore, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's actually part of its conditioning and process of changing that habitat. So yeah, super important. Thank you, Dan.
well, thanks everyone for attending again. And Yeah,
I
looking
do
forward.
see a question. I do see a question. Just
Oh,
one second.
wait, I can't see that
Is
either.
it possible to get copies of the slideshows? Uh, so the webinars will be online, so they'll be there for review. I think that's probably the easiest question.
I
Um,
think that's probably the way to get, yeah, because I find my I'm not I work with tech, but I'm also I don't know how to compress this stuff. My slideshow is like 600 megabytes. I don't know how to send that to anybody. It's crazy long and big.
we
And
do have a
I have
request.
quality pictures as I possibly can. So
We
anyway,
do have
but
a
there is
request. We have a request to turn your diagram into the star diagram with wind added as the.
it's just that I'll think about it. I'm working on it, but I don't know how to do that yet. It's complex. I also want a 3D one to add time in. Think about that. Now, right? Like, yeah.
Um, and thank you so much, guys. Yeah, I do think they are building towards with ecology, there's never a quick fix. And so you really do need to understand the systems before you can make insightful plans. And so thank you so much for bearing with us through this whole process. And hopefully, when it gets to the point when we're actually considering action, that you'll have a lot more questions and a lot more uh, positive outcomes for yourself when you're actually planning this stuff out and like drawing it out or thinking about it. You'll be able to say, I am on a cliff, or I am, near a salt marsh, or this is what I'm dealing with, or the bank I'm dealing with is only 1 meter tall. So like I have different options than something that's 6 meters tall. So yeah, whole bunch to think about. It's a really complex system, but yeah, it's important that I think our community understands how these incredibly important ecosystems work.
Yeah, because sometimes it is advocation too. Like you can do as much as you can in your own property, but maybe you have really great land stewards. Maybe you recognize you've got a coastal wetland and you can talk to your local watershed group, you know. So there's lots of different ways that you can engage, and there's lots of different land use planning issues coming up politically on PEI. We don't have a land use plan for the PEI. So there is going to be public consultation, and I think as coastal land stewards and as coastal property owners, the results of that are really important to you, not just for your own, like not just what you're allowed to do on your property, but what others are doing on the coastline that is going to affect your property, right? We're in this together. So that is something that's important to have this information so that when you're voting or dealing with these things, you can make informed decisions. Because again, nothing wrong with, none of this is to put any moralistic judgment. It's just to start going, can we see what our choices do, both good and bad, as far as what our goals are, and how do we, just take that into account and know when we're, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong camera. Know when we're know what we've lost and just be okay with that. It's okay to sign off on losing something. But if you're not aware that you're losing it and then later you're like, "Oh, I could have used that river." That's the moment that you don't want. So and also go for a walk. The weather's warming. Go out to your coastal property or any coastal property and just like walk around and think about like extrospectate. Is that the word now? Did I get it right? Anyway, yeah, get out and do that because that's where you like you'll have aha moment. It's like the Eric's moment of kids camp where we get kids to look at animal paws and then be like, look at your own hands, and you'll have like a 6-year-old just suddenly be like, "Whoo, I'm an animal," right? It's a moment, right? And so sometimes when you're listening to all this stuff and then you get out and actually walk the coast, you'll have a moment where you'll also go like, oh, erosion. I've thought about it for 20 years and now I get it. Like, anyway, those moments are wonderful. I'll stop talking.
Thank you all. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right, bye.